Welcome, everybody, and especially Dr. Kurt Gray. I'm very happy that Kurt has spared some time from his new move, his new job at Ohio University. And I'm very happy to sort of introduce him, not just as an artist, but as a sort of N4 cheerleader and major psychologist in the field of sort of moral understanding and divides in this country. Kurt and I go back a few years. We go back when I first attended a conference actually in North Carolina at the University of Chapel Hill, where was a professor for the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. And it was a 2-day symposium where scientists and practitioners in the field got together and sort of shared cutting edge research and insights around, what really divides us and how we can sort of bring people, back together. And that's really when I got hooked on Kurt's work. Currently, Kurt is sort of helping Narrative 4 with a major research project, which will sort of close out at the end of this year. But we're measuring how the story exchange can possibly lead to positive action, some kind of service learning or civic engagement. So I'm very, very happy to work with Dr. Kurt Gray and also his colleague, Emily Kubin. So Curve is the author of Outraged. The essential premise, right, is sort of how we look at moral outrage and how empathy and understanding sort of can bring us back together, or at least closer together, perhaps walking towards each other. He's a psychologist. He's a brilliant thinker. He's also got a good sense of humor, as you can just tell. And he's super connected to sort of what it means to be human and how we can be better, better humans together. So you're in for a treat. And I am simply welcoming Dr. Kurt Gray into the Narrative 4 fray.
Right. Nice to see everybody. I'm excited to be talking about outraged and how to not be as outraged. My apologies if there's nothing in my house except a ladder and some lamps. We just moved here from North Carolina, and life is chaos. So um, I'm happy to take questions in the chat, but it's going to be hard for me to look at the chat. So, but there'll be time at the end to ask all sorts of questions. Um, yeah, but if anything seems unclear, definitely let me know. I'm a professor, so I'm used to students being like falling asleep in class or checking their phones. So you won't hurt my feelings, anything you do. All right, here we go. So I probably don't have to tell you that we are pretty divided in America today. That motivates a lot of the work that I know Narrative 4 does, and that a lot of other practitioners and organizations do as well. You can just take a look at this chart, this graph. I'm a scientist, so I love graphs. And you can see that, in the 90s, liberals and conservatives were a little bit far apart. And then our policy positions have moved further and further apart through the years. And this is just where we are in terms of policy. If you look in terms of how much we dislike the other side, if we're willing to date the other side, we're way further apart than we've ever been. And so, you know, you can just look at an interaction like this and know that they're not having a wonderful, beautiful civil exchange of ideas, right? There's a lot of hostility here, and it's not great for our relationships, and it's not great for our country. I think this matters in our life in all sorts of ways. It matters for the workplace, and it matters for families. One study that came out that I really liked looked at how long people sat at the Thanksgiving dinner table on the day of Thanksgiving. And they analyzed whether dinner had only either liberals or conservatives, or liberals and conservatives sitting together. And if your dinner is bipartisan, they found that people left dinner half an hour earlier, um, which is terrible, right? Like, that's pie. So it seems like if we're so divided that we don't have time for pie anymore, we need to find a way to come back together again so we could all enjoy our pie. And so what I do is I study why we fight about morality in politics, and hopefully how we can come back together and make it better. And so a lot of the work I'm talking about today comes from a lot of the experiments that I've done, a lot of the studies I've done in my lab, and it's also motivated by my own personal experiences being a Canadian, with a lot of family in Nebraska who lean very different politically than I do. All right. So here we go. The talk's structured into three big parts. One, why we fight and get outraged. Two, how the morality of liberals and conservatives does or really doesn't differ as much as we might think deep down. And three, how to bridge divides and have better conversations. And here we're going to practice having conversations about morality and politics with a partner. So it'll be fun, I think. And I should say that I'm a moral psychologist. So I study how people make decisions. I study how our minds work. I don't study what the right answer is. That's for your guru or your pastor or your resident philosopher. It's not for me to tell you or look inside your heart and soul. I just tell you how our mind works based on my studies. And of course, half of America disagrees, what the right answer should be in all sorts of issues. And so it can be hard to find the real right answer for a lot of things. Okay. So why do we fight and why do we get outraged? Well, there are two easy but wrong answers, I think, that we automatically think of when we think of polarization. One is that the other side is stupid, right? We've all had that that feeling, right? Oh, well, they're just brainwashed, they're sheeple, they're not smart like I am. Or two, they hate us, right? If I know the moral correct answer, they're either stupid or they're evil. But let's think about this idea that the other side is much more stupid than I am. It could be easy to assume that the other side, has nothing in its mind and just is making idiot decisions. And if you're talking about things like, I don't know, geopolitical alliances or the state of the economy, you might be very confident that you know the right answer. You're like, the Middle East, here's the solution, right? Here's what we should be doing. Or, taxation or the economy, right? Like, this is what we should be doing. We are generally confident about how complex things work, and these things are very complex. But I think we might be able to have a little humility, a little more humility in our lives, and this could make our conversations go a little better, and we could be a little less outraged as well. And to allow us to get a little humbler, I want us to think about something much simpler. And put in the chat if you've never seen a bicycle. Has everyone seen a bicycle? I think probably. I think you're like, speaking of stupid, this guy's an idiot. Of course, I've seen a bicycle. But it's important to ask if you've seen a bike. And what I'd like you to do now is to get a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil. And I would like you to draw a bicycle in sufficient detail that you can see how it works. That if an alien came down from another planet, they would be like, oh, yeah, I get how it works. That's a bike. And so take a couple minutes, draw a bike. All right. See a couple people still working. I'll give you like a little more seconds. All right. Good drawing, everybody. I see some smirks. When I do this exercise in person, I like walking around um, and people aren't as good as they expect themselves to be. All right. So here are the kind of things that people draw. Maybe this is something that you drew. None of these are bicycles, not working bicycles. None of these can drive or work. This is a working bicycle. There's like two triangles, right? Two kind of like chain rings, a chain, some handlebars. Maybe you drew this. If you did, congratulations. If you didn't, it doesn't mean you're stupid, right? What it does mean is that we overestimate how much we know about complex things and even simple things like a bicycle. And so what that means is that when you're talking about the economy or geopolitical alliances, then maybe we should have a little more humility in our conversations. And so if the other side isn't dumb, or at least no real dumber than we feel right now after the bicycle exercise, then you might think, well, they hate us, right? They're just bent on destruction. And this is the story told by political and media elites, who Amanda Ripley, the author, calls conflict entrepreneurs, right? These are the people who make money, who get clicks, who get ad revenue from sowing a narrative of destruction and despair. And I call this the destruction narrative because it's the idea that the other side is like some superhero villain and they just want to burn it all down. This narrative is incredibly popular on social media, right? Where it gets us outraged, drives clicks, right? Drives attention. But at the end of the day, this narrative is not true. And there's lots of researchers out there who show that the other side doesn't actually hate us. And in fact, if they do hate us, it's because they think that we hate them, right? They're reacting to what they see as our perceived hate. And rather than a destruction narrative, I think the more accurate narrative is a protection one, right? People are acting to protect themselves and their family and society. And when people cast a vote, right, they cast that vote because they're trying to protect their values and their family. Now, those values are certainly in conflict with each other, and sometimes people might feel threatened by other people's values, right? That's certainly true. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that no one votes or acts in the world just to burn it all down, right? They're trying to protect themselves in some way. And so you might think, well, then what drives moral conflict, right? If we're all trying to protect ourselves. In fact, that's the key to understanding what drives conflict. When people are worried about their safety, right? When people feel threatened, when people feel victimized, those are the things that get us into moral conflict. Those are the things that drive moral outrage. And so at the end of the day, we get outraged because we feel vulnerable to harm, right? Because we feel worried about what's happening in the world, because we look on social media and feel attacked, right? And so, how do we combat the threat of these threats? Well, we get outraged, right? That's what we do, right? We try to get outraged to kind of stop these threats. And then you might say, well, why do we feel so vulnerable, right? We live in the safest era we've ever lived in for, millions of years. We're the safest, the healthiest that we've ever been right now. Well, I think we need to look back those millions of years to understand why we feel so vulnerable. We need to look into human nature. And if you look at anthropology, right, you might think that our status today is apex predators, and we are apex predators today. We can shoot wolves from helicopters, right? You can go to the supermarket, buy any kind of meat you want. You're like, I feel like eating alligator. You just go buy it if you live in the South, I guess. Um, but we were not always predators, right? Instead, we were mostly prey. So this is an artist's rendition of a skull that they found in some caves in South Africa from millions of years ago, or where we evolved, right? We were more hunted than hunter. And I can just give you another example, which is look at your claws. All right, look at the claws of a human being, our evolved claws, and look at the claws of other predators. We have soft claws that can't do anything, right? Our bodies are fundamentally the bodies of prey, which is why we live in groups together and not predators. Um, and so at the end of the day, we're more prey than predator, and we generally live in fear, oftentimes. Maybe you're not afraid right now, but it's very easy to be afraid of predators. Maybe you're walking down a dark alley and you're afraid of someone coming to get you, right? Or maybe, right, you see kids playing outside and see a white panel van drive slowly up and down the street. You don't think that white panel van is a locksmith that's lost trying to find its way, right? You think of them as kidnappers casing your neighborhood to steal your kids, right? We're still afraid of predators. And how do we combat the threat of these predators or these folks that we're worried are out to get us? Well, again, we get outraged, right? We try to like rile people up and expel them. We try to get angry, right? And so we, put them into prison or we punish them in some ways, right? Outrage is what happens when we feel threatened. And so the way to think about moral divides is it's different visions of what's most threatening and how to address those threats. And so, for instance, if you are pro gun control, you might really worry about how guns can cause mass shootings, right, and harm children. But if you are pro gun rights, you are also worried about threats. You're worried about the threats of someone coming in your house, harming your family, right? And you might see guns as a way to protect yourself from this harm. And so if you're having a conversation or a discussion or an argument about morality and politics, you need to ask yourself, who's the other side trying to protect from harm and how are they trying to do it? Okay. And so the short answer for why we fight and get outraged, right, is that we want to protect ourselves and others from harm, right? Not because we're trying to burn it all down. All right. So we all have ultimately the same kind of moral sense, but it's clear that liberals and conservatives disagree. And so, how does our morality differ? Well, it's obvious, right, that liberals and conservatives do disagree about so many issues. or at least the issues that make the news. Turns out we actually probably agree on 95% of things out there, right? But we certainly do agree about or disagree about some things. And it's easy to assume that this disagreement comes from deeply different minds, right? The liberals and conservatives have somehow different minds. But ultimately, I think this is a myth, right? There's not some values that only conservatives have or some values only liberals have. Instead, we all ultimately have the same mind. We all condemn harm, right? Because we're all worried about protecting ourselves and others. We condemn those who we see as causing harm, harming the vulnerable, for instance. But here's the thing, harm is a matter of perception. And that perception hinges on how we're raised, on the assumptions we make about the world, right? You might see this and say, look, smoking marijuana after a hard day at work, it's a great way to relax and help me fall asleep. Or you might say, people who smoke marijuana are destroying the American family and they are taking the first step to destroying civilization, right? You can see different things in the same act. And in fact, these disagreements about what's harmful drives moral debate in all sorts of issues. We've got things like gay marriage, we've got immigration, we've got guns, we've got abortion. Almost anything you think about, right, that we disagree about, it's because people are making different assumptions, different perceptions about harm. And so a lot of these debates come down to the question of who ultimately seems the most vulnerable to victimization, to pain and suffering. If we're all worried about protecting people, right? We all agree it's bad to abuse kids. But then the question is, well, who else do we really need to worry about pain and suffering and mistreatment, right? We can all agree that this kid here, right, can suffer. But there's many instances where we disagree about people suffering because the pain of others is not obvious to us, right? This is why we do things like story exchanges, for instance, right? To kind of know what other people are feeling. And so a good example is a soccer player, for instance, right? If you are on the red team and you see the soccer player like take a fall and grab his leg, you're like, come on, you're not suffering at all, right? You're just a crybaby. You're just making it up so we can get a penalty kick, right? They can get a penalty kick. Or, but if you're on the blue team, you're like, oh my goodness, this poor guy, he's the victim of the evil red team, right? He's just trying his best and they like did this terrible foul to him, right? So sports is an occasion where one team versus another, or a lot like politics, right, have vastly different perceptions of who's like making up suffering, who's putting on this idea as a victimhood, right? But the key is that when you see that victimhood, it's legitimately perceived. And just look at something like abortion, right? Which really comes down to, should we prioritize and be concerned about the victimization of the suffering of pregnant women? Or should we be concerned mostly about the victimization, right, or potential suffering of a fetus, right? Pro-life and pro-choice people, pro-choice and pro-life people all care about women and they all care about, unborn children. But the key is that they are relatively weighting some of that suffering more than others, right? And that's really what's going on here. And the thing with abortion is that it's impossible to know for certain, right, what the mental life of a 12-week-old fetus is, for instance. And so a lot of these questions when it comes to morality is ultimately about who we assume are most vulnerable to harm, to victimization, and to suffering. And in my research, we've asked thousands of people about, how much do you think these different things are vulnerable to harm or are most susceptible to kind of victimization? And what we find is that a lot of debates kind of hinge on perceptions of full clusters, like the environment, like coral reef and the rainforest, the othered, you might call it kind of marginalized folks, although sometimes very right-leaning people say, well, how do we know who's really marginalized? And so I think a more kind of like general, non-controversial term is the othered, right? This idea of like some people are othered in society, kind of pushed outside the center of power in society, like undocumented immigrants and trans people. We've got the powerful, corporate leaders, state troopers, how much are they victimized? And then the divine, like Jesus and God. And so liberals and conservatives, right, all agree that in general, the environment and the othered are more vulnerable to harm than the powerful and the divine. But there's some really big differences here, right? So if you're conservative, you generally see these things as kind of all similarly vulnerable to harm, right? It doesn't matter if you are a cop or you're an immigrant, right? You can be cut or if you're cut, you bleed. If your kids are sick, you get upset, right? All of us can suffer in a kind of like deeply equal human way. On the other hand, progressives are more likely to say, sure, we might all suffer in one sense, but in another sense, some people and some groups of people are much more likely to be victimized than others. So they will see, progressives, the othered is much more vulnerable to harm than the powerful. And this explains all sorts of hot button issues, right? So why extreme progressives think it's okay to say eat the rich, and extreme conservatives think it's okay to say taxation's theft, right? These are very different positions based on who they think is kind of vulnerable to harm. Or consider the debate between Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, right? So Black Lives Matter is all about the relative vulnerability of othered or marginalized peoples, much more than the police. Whereas Blue Lives Matters folks will say, well, police put their lives on the line every day. And it's really important to kind of like think about not only all lives, but in particular, blue lives as well. And so I'm not saying you have to agree with these perceptions, but that by appreciating these perceptions, you can make sense of these moral divides as coming from this desire or this concern about protection. Um, and and I always like to use this visual illusion because I think it really hits home what's going on here. Right? And that's that sometimes when you have a conversation with someone about morality or politics, it can seem like their concerns about victimhood are just made up. You're like, "You don't really see that. You're just saying it to, like, get me angry or just, like, repeating talking points on the news or whatever." But our work shows that it's really, really legitimate, right? There's, like, genuine perceptions. And so I like to look at this diagram here, because we all get the sense that A is darker than B, right? That's the way it looks. And you would probably argue until you're blue in the face that A is darker than B. But when I put this on, you'll see, in fact, they're the exact same shade of gray. They're the exact same darkness. Right? You're like, "Okay, cool. I'll see it now." And then I remove it, and then you still can't see it, right? You're just like, "No, 100% A is darker than B. I don't care what you show me," right? And of course, this is just, the shade of gray, but the key point is when we talk about morality, right, we still, even if I showed you some facts, right, that show A is equal to B, right, you're just like, "I don't know. That's not how it works. That's not how my wine works." And so at the end of the day, right, to understand moral divides, you have to think about the harms that someone else sees, right? And they really do see it in a powerful way. And this is so useful because understanding or appreciating the perceptions of harm that other people have allows us to find common ground, right? See common ground. And so, although it's easy to assume that liberals and conservatives have different moral minds, right? At the end of the day, we all share the same moral minds, right? We all seek to protect the vulnerable from harm, but harm and vulnerability are matters of perception, and liberals and conservatives ultimately see vulnerability different. Conservatives are more likely to see everyone as kind of more equally vulnerable to harm, where liberals are really more likely to divide the world into, the vulnerable oppressed and the kind of less vulnerable oppressors. And understanding this kind of mindset really helps us understand these debates. Okay. So we talked about why we fight and get outraged, how the morality of liberals and conservatives does or really doesn't differ, and then how to bridge divides and have better conversations is what we'll get into now, right? This is where the rubber meets the road, and when you're having conversations with somebody, where we can use tools to really make for better conversations. And I've used these myself, for instance, in having conversations with an Uber driver who's a Christian nationalist, right? You can use these anywhere, even in conversations. You're like, really? Would that conversation go well? And these tools help it almost always go well. Okay, so how do we best bridge divides? This is something that lots of folks are interested in, something that I study. and something that you might assume that people already know the answer to. You could just ask people, right? Like, why am I wasting my time doing studies? You just ask people, how best do you bridge divides? Well, we did that, right? We're like, we asked people, what would make you respect a political opponent if you're having a conversation with them? Just tell me, right? Just like write down in a box, like, what do you think it would be? And this is what we found when we asked a lot of people. Most people say, I want facts and evidence. And some people say maybe personal experience. Some people say, well, just acknowledging they respect me, that could be good. And other people just said other. But the majority of people said facts and evidence, right? They're like, I want people to use facts, to rely on evidence, and then we'll have some common ground because we're just not making stuff up. We've got the facts as bedrock, right? And not personal experience. But let's think about it, right? Do facts really help us see the harms that other people see? Right? Like, what happens if we threw a fact in here, right? We're like, oh my goodness, what this interaction needs is one more fact, right? The guy with the flag says, like, hey, I don't know if you heard this, but I heard this fact on Fox News that you didn't know about. And now the woman with the sign is going to be like, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, you're right. That is a great fact. I guess we'll all agree now, right? You're right. Or think back to your own conversations, right? You've been arguing about something and you're like, here's this fact that I heard on NPR. Or someone's like, here's this fact that I read in a newspaper. And then everyone's like, you know what? Let's just give up our moral positions because that fact, that's airtight, right? Never happens. And in fact, in our studies, when we give people the facts, we're like, here are the facts you wanted. You told us you wanted facts. Here are the facts. They're like, those are not the right facts. I want the real facts and not the fake facts. And so because we live in different kind of social media ecosystems, your facts are not my facts, right? Facts do not work, right? Because we have a different set of facts that we're approaching it from. And of course, there are facts out there, right? I'm a scientist. There are facts out there that we can, that are the truth. But the thing is, we disagree about what that truth is. And in conversations, right, they're not making us have better conversations. So I think the better way to do it is to use storytelling instead of facts and stats. And that's probably why I'm here, right? And working with narrative for because storytelling has such an immense power when it comes to bridging divides, right? We know that when people hang out right around a campfire, what they do is they tell stories about their life. They don't talk about statistics. I have taught college students statistics. It is a real pain in the ass. These things are hard to learn, right? To learn about like the central limit theorem and like what does it mean to do a test and like what are variances? Those things take a while to learn. Telling a story and appreciating a story is something that, you can do to a 2-year-old and they appreciate it. And when it comes to bridging divides, what's really powerful is sharing personal experiences of harm, right? Because we know that it's rational for people to want to avoid harm. We understand so deep, right, in our brains and our bodies that it makes sense to avoid harm. And so when people shares a story about them trying to avoid harm, we get it, right? Even if we disagree with their kind of starting assumptions about it. And so we've run lots of studies on this. I'll give you one example. We ran a study on campus on UNC. We had one person, a student who was an accomplice, right? She was in cahoots with us and she pretended to be walking around campus. And we recruited another person walking around, oftentimes, let's say, like an alumna. And they would sit down, right? It's kind of like a middle aged lady talking to a student. And we'd say, hey, would you guys mind having a quick conversation? And the student's like, "Yeah, sure, of course," because she's, our research assistant. And then the lady says, "Sure, I'll talk to this kind student." Great. We say, "Great, you're going to talk about guns, right? What's your position on guns?" And now the person's like, "Oh no, what I get myself into," right? And so the passerby usually says, "Well, I'm, pro gun control, I guess." And then our accomplice, the student says, I don't know how anyone could be pro gun controlled. Frankly, that's un American, right? She just like pulled out all the stops because she wanted to get it like, let's get some conflict here. And then she says, and here's why, right? I'm pro gun rights. She either uses a fact, right, that guns are used somewhere between 70,000 and 1.5 million times per year in America in self defense, or told a story from her life, right? That one day her mom used a gun to defend her and her family from a home intruder, right? It's not a fact in the sense that it captures lots of statistics, but it is something that happened to her. We recorded these conversations, and then we had another team of research assistants code these conversations or rated them for how respectful they were. And what we found was that when people used personal experiences, right, in conversations, they were more respectful. We looked at the YouTube comments for abortion videos, right, which are not a place known to be incredibly respectful or compassionate, right? People either telling their stories about abortion or talking about facts. And again, what did we find? Well, when people told their story, it was more respectful and more compassionate. You can also use stories to bridge some of the biggest divides. This is Narrative 4's work, right? There's an amazing case study of Todd Underwood, who auctioned off the handgun that killed Trayvon Martin, right? Pro-gun rights. And Carolyn Tuft watched her daughter die in a mass shooting, pro-gun control. They had an incredibly empathic conversation by exchanging stories, right? By sharing their personal experiences with each other, right? Not throwing facts. So stories of personal experience bridge divides, but of course, facts still matter. And it's clear, right, that telling stories is challenging, right? It's hard to just talk to a stranger on a plane and you're like, here's my personal experience about guns or drugs or abortion, right? People find a way to tell that to me on planes because I say I'm a psychologist, which is why I say I'm not the helping kind of psychologist. But, it's maybe easier than you think, but it's not super easy. And so that's why I'm going to give you a few tips on how to start a civil conversation. And we're going to practice them in just a sec. Okay, so pay attention. Uh, so the three tips are connect, invite, validate. And I've got these from talking to my friends at the organization Essential Partners, John Saroof. Does all sorts of dialogue in really, really conflict-filled situations, like war and after shootings. And so these tips, I think, are useful in kind of getting the process going. Okay, so if you want to talk politics with someone, you're not sure how to start, here's what we do. All right, connect. So before you talk about politics, you want to talk to someone like a person, right? We are so much deeper than just politics, right? We care about movies and music and food and travel and pets, right? There's so much to us, right? We contain multitudes. And so what you can do is share these experiences, but most importantly, ask people questions. Especially deep questions. We severely underestimate how much people dislike answering questions. In fact, it's the best way to get to know someone. There's a study that asked people commuting on the train into Chicago, right? Would you rather sit silently or have deep conversation with strangers? And people are like, that sounds really weird. I do not want to have a conversation with a stranger. I want to sit silently. And then they say, too bad. Half of you are randomly assigned to talk to strangers. Like sit down on the train and be like, hey, how do you think you're going to die one day? Who's your first love? Right? Like these incredibly deep questions that people think you're like, that's crazy. But in fact, after asking people these deep questions and answering them themselves, they felt so much better, right? Because we're all trying to find a way to connect with people in today's disconnected, like looking at your phone age, right? And like talking about the weather is not doing it, right? Pretty hot, pretty humid out there today. Like how many times can we have that conversation? But instead, if you get to like when's the first time you felt joy this week? Or like, what do you plan to do next year? Right? What do you want to do when you retire? Whatever, right? Ask deep questions. We are wrong about how much people like answering them. All right. So you're asking questions, you're asking deeper questions than you think, right? Or think about like going on a first date, right? No one wants someone who just only talks about themselves. You want someone who asks questions, who wants to know who you are and what you're like. And then you're going to invite them to talk about politics, okay? But don't demand them. Don't demand, right? There's an invitation. You want to ask them to help you understand where they're coming from. I had someone who read the book email me a while ago, and they said, look, this tip doesn't work. I invited my neighbor to talk about politics, and it didn't work. We didn't have a simple conversation. And then I asked, well, how did you invite them? And she says, here's what I asked him. I was like, how can you have the stance on immigration? Are you pro genocide? Like, explain it to me. And I was like, that's not an invitation, be like, justify why you like genocide, because I bet this dude isn't into genocide, right? And that's not an invitation. An invitation is saying, hey, I think you voted differently in the last election. And I know there's lots of talk in the news these days about immigration. And I would just really love to understand kind of, where you're coming from and your thoughts about it. And like, let's get beyond the talking points on, social media. I want to know why you have this view and your kind of thoughts and experiences surrounding this topic. And if today is not the right day, that's totally fine. But I just love to kind of understand, where you're coming from. This desire to connect, right, is what it's based on, right? I want to understand you. Great. Okay, you invite them. They share. Maybe they share some things that are going to piss you off a little bit, right? Because they're like trying to put their messy feelings into words. But even if you get a little pissed off, um, you kind of want to validate them, right? Because they are worried, the predator prey thing, like they just bared their neck to you. They're like sharing their views on something. And instead of being like, yeah, but what about this? Or like, what about genocide? Right. You want to be like, you know what? I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. I know it's hard to share, and I appreciate that. Okay. So this is where things like active listening come in. And I think at the end of the day, the term I really like, and I talk to a lot of religious organizations, is this idea of grace, right? Even if you're not religious, that's fine. Grace is just knowing that other people are trying to do their best and affording them the kind of like, best intentions behind what they're saying, right? So have a little grace with them and with you too, right? If you get a little uncomfortable, that's fine too, right? Give ourselves grace in these situations because they're hard and they're messy. Okay. Now is the time for a little bit of practice. Before we get to practice, any quick questions about CIV? Connect, invite, and validate before we go. All right, great. So just do your best. You're going to have a conversation with someone. Try to get to something meaty and political if you can, but first do this, right? It could be abortion, it could be immigration, but before you get there, try connect, invite, and validate and see how it goes. Okay, it'll go better than you think. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. You at least had some interesting experiences with the other person. I should say that I teach a class on this to students, and they go home and they talk to their roommates about immigration, or they talk to their grandparents about racism in North Carolina, and those are contentious topics, and they go better than you might think. Felice asked a really great question, which is, what happens if in the conversation someone says something that's super offensive to you and kind of attacks your very sense of self? And I just want to say that no one, should have to have conversations that they don't want to have. I will say though that in the quest to persuade someone, right, the kind of just going to persuade them is not the way to change hearts and minds. Instead, trying to understand where they're coming from is. So there's a gentleman named Daryl Davis. He's a blues musician, a black man who has befriended over the course of his career hundreds of KKK members and has convinced them to hang up their robes, not by telling them that they're evil, right, but instead by understanding where they're coming from. And, they go to diners and these guys will say, well, the reason that I'm a part of the KKK is I just know black men are like violent. And that's why there's, so many black men in prison. And so Daryl will be like, I understand you're trying to protect your family, but do I seem violent to you? Right. And so there might be other reasons why there's so many black men in prison. Right. Kind of getting at those things. And the course of these conversations, which are, I'm sure, incredibly offensive, right, to Mr. Davis, just has a way of understanding where they're coming from and changing their behavior. So again, you shouldn't have to have these conversations if you don't want to, but if you do, and you're trying to kind of, you know, evoke change, to do that, we need to kind of at least meet people where they are, at least initially. But it's a great question. Okay, so we got a couple minutes left. I'll just kind of wrap up. All right, so how do we best bridge divides? Well, it's good to think about that we all have concerns about harm, and at the end of the day, facts are important, but stories are a good way at the beginning to bridge divides, and they work better than facts. And that if you can, remember CIV in conversations when you have them. And again, this doesn't make conversations easy, especially when you start to have these conversations and you feel your blood pressure rise. And my friend John Saruf, the guy who helped with these tips, he says it takes a fifth of a second for your flight or fight kind of response to happen and 20 minutes for your body to come back down. That's a huge asymmetry. And the way around this is just practice, right? The way that you don't get as kind of upset or as kind of impassioned is just to practice having these conversations as best you can. Okay. So at the end of the day, right, why we fight about morality and politics and how the morality of conservatives and liberals does or doesn't differ and how to bridge divides and have better conversations are things that we've talked about. And I hope you've learned a little bit from it. At the end of the day, right, polarization is not going away. It's not like tomorrow will be like, oh my goodness, right? Like kumbaya, let's everyone get along. But I think, knowing these key points can be helpful. So one, the other side isn't a monster or bent on destruction. Everyone ultimately wants to protect themselves and their family. Harm and therefore morality is often a matter of perception. And that the best way to bridge divides, I've found in the studies, is by telling stories and by being civil. And so hopefully these tips are useful for having conversations with your colleagues, with your friends and family, especially over the Thanksgiving dinner table. And my wish to you is that knowing this stuff will hopefully allow you to eat pie next time you get together. And if you want to learn more, you can check out the book. I should say that there's, it was like featured in some stuff, but there's a website called outragedbook.com. And even if you don't buy the book, there's a ton of resources there that you can download that can make it useful. There's like an AI tool we've developed. There's a way to think about like a little test for your own assumptions of vulnerability. So there's lots of resources there that you can use to kind of take the lessons here and try to use them in your life. So thanks very much for listening. I think we got a couple minutes for questions, and I appreciate your time.
So I guess, well, first of all, I wanted to thank you so much, Kurt. I loved your book. Really, really loved it. And I love narrative horror. And so the connection is really great. And actually Lee Keelock was the one who recommended it. And I got to meet with him. I guess my question is, and maybe this is too big, but one of the things that I'm noticing, especially in the United States, is a difference between um some of some of us, out myself, but some of us who are more on the left versus people who are more on the right. I feel like one of the differences, definitely harm, but there's a sense of, I, for me, and I guess many of the other people who are in similar philosophy, it's like there's definitely the harm is at the center, but there's this feeling of like, I'm worried about harm, not just for me and my family. I'm worried about harm for a broader amount of people, whereas I feel like people on the right are more, this is my perception, is that more, it's more about like what's going to happen to me and if it affects me. And I don't know. I'm curious if that's a divide that holds up, or if that's just from my lens, or yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there may be two answers to that. So one, research shows that generally the further right you are, the more you kind of are maybe more focused on kind of, let's say, like buy American, and let's put our money in my own community, in our churches, right? And versus like let's help someone that I've never met before far away. So there is that kind of difference. Like it's kind of wrapped up in what it means to be a modern conservative is to kind of focus a little more locally, but it's not a huge effect. And I think many conservatives will say that they're thinking about the future and protecting people as well, right? So like we need to be concerned about immigration because illegal immigrants are coming up and they're harming Americans and citizens, right? So I think they're more likely to see it um, as like an either or, right? Like the more we help these folks, the less we can help our folks. But one, they are legitimately trying to help other folks, right? Like church missions will go to Guatemala, will go to to places that honestly most liberals do not go and do missions, right? And maybe you're like, well, it's in the service of like spreading their religion, but like these people are risking their lives to go to like Sierra Leone or, the Democratic Republic of the Congo to like do their work. So I think, it's kind of both sides a little bit there. And I guess to get to Michael's question too, which is like what someone comes to you with a harsh term like genocide, is the last thing I'll do is maybe tell this story since we know storytelling works. And that is that I took an Uber to the airport some time ago and I told the driver that I studied morality and politics, and he says, "Oh, like that's what you study? Well, here's what I think. I'm a Christian nationalist, but not the typical kind." And I had never met a Christian nationalist, let alone an atypical one. And I could have been like, "Whoa, that's crazy." But instead I said, "Oh, I've never met a Christian nationalist, let alone an atypical one. Maybe you could tell me kind of like what that means to you." And so here's what I think about the church, and here's what I think about the state, and here's what I think about the family. And a lot of the positions are positions that I don't totally agree with, obviously. But I listened and I asked follow up questions and active listening. And then as we got to the airport, we started talking about abortion, obviously, make it a little more contentious. And he says, I don't know how anyone could be pro-choice. I think if you're pro-choice, you're basically like the Gestapo guards at the death camps in the Holocaust. And, that's obvious. That's coming at me with genocide, to, to quote you, Michael. But because I've listened for 20 minutes, right? And because I tried to connect and establish this rapport, I think, he'd come a long way. And so I said, you know, sorry, I'm happy to talk about abortion and politics, but like you can't liken half of America to the Gestapo. It's just not true. I teach a class on how to have conversations and you can't liken someone to Hitler. It's just not acceptable. And even though I know you're like coming from a good place. And he pauses and he says, "You know what? I'm sorry. I take it back." And those words are almost never uttered, right? Never uttered in conversation about morality and politics. But because I listened and because I tried to understand what he was thinking, he felt comfortable enough to be like, "I'm sorry. Let me take a step back. Here's what I was trying to say." And he basically explains a slippery slope idea where if you don't respect the sanctity of fetal life, you no longer respect the sanctity of other life. Okay, that's a reasonable philosophical idea. And we can kind of articulate that. Great, right? I don't agree with it, but I can see why like you might advance that idea. And then at the end of it, he says, "Okay, I've really had a great chat. Basically, you progressive academics aren't as bad as I thought," kind of thing. And I think he came closer to kind of my position, or making, realizing that folks who are maybe more on the left or more pro-choice or whatever are not kind of like monsters, right? We're all trying to like live our lives and just get to the airport together. And so that's how I think you can come at it, right? Just like do the CIV, try to understand, share your experiences, and I think things will go better in the long run. But yeah, thanks for listening, and I'm want to be respectful of your time, and I appreciate y'all coming out.